Jeff Fuller with you. Thank you so much for tuning in and making the time to subscribe to the YouTube channel, Jay Fuller Interviews, the YouTube channel, Jay Fuller Interviews, as well on Twitter, Instagram as Jay Fuller Interviews. And I'm so excited to be on the Google Podcast platform, the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews. Super long name, but a lot of fun because we get to feature tremendous guests like the next one we have, Amy Bass. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you come recommended by a mutual friend. I'll call him a friend. I've been able to interview him a few times now. Jeff Pearlman. Jeff is a phenomenal guy. I just love his candor. Can you just talk about what it's like for you to work with other authors, but to become friends with these colleagues?
Sure. It's a great place to start. Writing is a very solitary endeavor. You spend hours and hours and hours either doing research, often by yourself, or just staring at a blinking cursor. So writing is actually a super generous community. People make connections. I have to say, social media has made it much easier for the writing community to grow a little bit. But Jeff and I actually used to write side by side in the same cafe. We're both coffee house writers, diner writers, late night writers, etc. So Jeff and I, it's sort of a mutual admiration society and a process society, because we used to hang out in a coffee house called Swirl here in New York before Jeff became a full-time West Coaster. And we would just toil away. We sort of had our own code of when we would and wouldn't engage with each other. But there's a lot of solidarity in the writing community. And this happens in a couple different ways. I think back to January, which seems like it was 10 years ago. Key West Literary Seminar, so I was there with the likes of Leanne Shapton and Buzz Bissinger and Meg Abbott. And it's just, writers really like hanging out together. We like talking about failed book signings. We like talking about, the editor that shouldn't have been. It's a very collaborative community for a very solitary endeavor.
Amy, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Massachusetts.
And what led you into writing? Was that something as a child you enjoyed creative writing, or is that just something that kind of took form a little bit later on?
I am the daughter of two journalists, and my dad was a novelist, and my entire family is writers. So I think it mostly comes, it's great that, you sort of model maybe what your parents do or what your parents don't do. But I think more importantly than growing up writing, I grew up reading. I grew up in a house just full of books. And I think that's really important. I was just surrounded by words. I grew up respecting the power of words. I understand that writing can be your voice, and it's a voice that you have complete control over until you enter the publishing process, and then it becomes a little bit more collaborative and a little bit more commercial. But I think that that's the most important part of it, is just growing up understanding the power of language and how important it is.
All right, so a question I have for you, Amy Bass, amybass.net is where you can certainly find more information in her work. Latest book, One Goal, is there. And that is, sometimes parents who are writers, journalists, their kids do not want to follow in their footsteps. And as a coach and as a former player athlete, high school level, it's so difficult not to push my daughter to the point where she turns away. Yeah. How did your parents encourage you but didn't really pigeonhole you into doing what they were a part of?
Well, I was sort of the outsider in that it took me a long time to sort of establish an identity for myself as a writer, regardless of how other people saw me. Because I'm an academic in terms of like day job, right? I'm a historian. I'm a professor at Manhattanville College. I'm the chair of the sports studies department here at Manhattanville. And so for a long time, if somebody said, what do you do for a living? The answer was always, I'm a professor. And my father would sort of, dodge around that and be like, well, you're sort of a writer. One Goal is my fourth book, but I think it was very much sort of a coming of age for me as a writer. The way that I chose to tell the story of One Goal and sort of how it landed really sort of transitioned the way I see myself as a professor and adding that sort of moniker of writer.
Certainly. I want to talk about that book in a little bit, but do you have a love-hate relationship with Twitter? Because you only have a certain amount of characters. What are your thoughts on that form of social media?
I actually love Twitter. I mean, Instagram is my favorite platform of social media because I actually am a very visual writer, and I storyboard writing out visually. And so I don't know, Instagram for me is a place of serenity. Twitter's a cesspool, but it's a cesspool that, you can curate to a degree. So I have sort of a news feed that I like, that keeps me informed, that lets me hear from the people that I want to hear from. And in terms of responding, no, I think that learning how to make any kind of statement succinctly is something that I want every single one of my students to walk away from a class with me with. Say it short if you can. There's nothing worse than overwriting something. So I think Twitter's good about learning how to be potent and powerful with your words. And I think that, Twitter's also an open forum. You can't curate who's going to respond to you about things. And, Twitter finds you. So it's sort of a living, breathing comment section. And I respect that. I respect the forum that it is.
Now, I'm working with Corinne McCandless, who wrote The Wild Truth. Her brother was featured in Into the Wild.
Yeah, John Krakauer.
And and she's it's been interesting because you guys are so accessible now with social media. And she was just saying, Jeff, I'd love to do it. I just can't reply to you right now. And they're receiving so many messages from social media. Do you like that bond you get with fans, with readers, or do you wish there still was that distance of the publisher, the editor, something of that nature?
I mean, there's pros and cons to it. Once, you release anything, it's kind of interesting, Into the Wild, you lose control of it. I always say that the absolute best day for a writer is the day before your book comes out, because it's still, you don't know what anyone thinks about it yet. And then the day it comes out it's a nerve-wracking day. I am someone who tends to spend pub day not out celebrating with friends, but sort of on the floor of the kitchen being like, I don't want to know what anyone's tweeting. I don't want to know what anyone's saying. And then those next couple of weeks I find them really difficult. And then I sort of get into my rhythm of being okay with hearing from people. I love book events. I love talking to folks. I love engaging with readers. There is something incredibly nerve-wracking about sort of the anonymity that social media can create. And I don't love that. And, for anyone who thinks like, oh, just brush it off, it's so hard to brush it off. It's a punch in the stomach every time it happens. And it's funny because you started talking about Jeff Pearlman, and Jeff Pearlman is social media Teflon. He doesn't care. He puts himself out there and he says, bring it. I mean, I will say that I do think that there's a gender disparity there, because the way people go after him is very different from the way people go after me in the sports world. And I've written about that. I wrote a piece several years ago called Women Who Write About Sports and the Men Who Hate Them. And so that Twitter's not always a great place to be female.
Hey, so switching gears a little bit, your book, One Goal, does have high praise. Here is your website, amybass.net, and best book of 2018 from Boston Globe. Can you just talk about when it does come out and you do receive such praise, is it hard to believe? Are you your own worst critic? Is it easy to receive that critique from others? What do you go through as an author, as a writer, once you hear these compliments about your work?
I mean, it's incredibly gratifying. You have, it's very strange to see my own website up in front of me. But, Jane Levy's there. And, for her Wall Street Journal review. And I mean, who greater to have read your sports book than Jane, right? The greatest living sports biographer right now. So I think that, no, you love that. And I will say that Kirkus review that you have in front of there was I think, my favorite thing that I've ever seen about the book, because it really got it. And that's what you want. I mean, more than, did someone like it or did someone hate it? Did they get it? But for me, the most important part of One Goal was how the community that it's about felt about it. And so when I did go on the road, after the book launched, my first stop was Maine. And when I was in Maine, my first stop was not a bookstore, and it wasn't the library where I did a big event, and it wasn't Bates College where I'm an alum. I did go to all of those places, but the very first place that I took the book was Maine Immigrant and Refugee Services, because it was the Somali community that I wanted to be with first. And when I walked in the door of the event that day, which was unlike any book event I've ever done, it wasn't a reading, it wasn't a signing, it was just a gathering of love and goodwill of the people who are in the book and help make the book possible in this community in Maine that the book is about. And when I walked in, Abdi Kadir Negi, who's now a dear friend, said to me, "We did it." And that was the best thing anyone could have said to me about this book, that it was a collective effort and it was our book. And the fact that we talk about it in this plural sense, I didn't care what anyone else thought at that point. That was a solidifying moment for me in terms of any other critique that might come.
Amy, what led you to this story and then motivated you to write about and produce One Goal?
Yeah, I was actually partway through another book that still has yet to be finished. When the story of One Goal came to my attention, this Lewiston soccer team. Lewiston is where I went to college. It's where Bates College is. So it's sort of, as a graduate of Bates, Lewiston is always sort of on your radar. And it was a very particular political moment in the United States, which, looking back, it seems almost naive to say that about 2015. But the terrorist attacks in Paris had just happened, and Obama's plan to bring Syrian refugees into this country was coming under attack because of these, disproven myths and rumors about who had done the bombings in Paris that night, that terrible, terrible night. One of which took place, of course, it's at the soccer stadium. And so you have these governors coming forward in response to the Syrian refugee plan, saying we don't want refugees in our states. And that was the first thing that sort of raised my eyebrows. I'm a historian by training. Governors don't get to decide who does and doesn't live in their states. Refugee relocation is a federal plan. And then there was this team playing soccer, and it was a team in Maine, the second whitest state in the country. And all but one of the starting roster members was a Somali refugee. And so it felt like something needed to be said about what was going on with this team and this community in the midst of just what felt like then to just be crazy. The vitriol about refugee resettlement and what had happened in Paris. So I wrote like 900 words for CNN about it. And then came the comment section and the tweets to that piece. And as scary as the comments were to that piece, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia, it was quite obvious that a nerve had been hit. And when you hit a nerve like that, you keep going.
So when you hit a nerve like that, there is a responsibility, but there's also, I would, a truth out.
Yeah, I just went all in. I remember probably 2 weeks after I settled with a publishing house, I'd written only the CNN piece at that point when we sold the book. And I remember walking into my then 9-year-old daughter's bedroom and saying, you're going away to camp this summer, because I did feel pressure. I did feel a moral responsibility. And as I was writing the book, it became more intense because America's, explosion into division and into more overt forms of racism and more overt forms of xenophobia, anti-immigrant stances, anti-refugee stances. It just felt like I woke up every morning thinking I have to publish this book as soon as possible. Because this is a coming together story. It's a coming together story by a community that is dealing with something that very few communities deal with in terms of its size and scale. And it just felt like this was a story that could work, hopefully, some magic. And I think it does. I think that this team worked magic. I think the community that it played for, that it continues to play for, creates magic. And just every day it felt like there was this huge onus of responsibility to get this story out. And that's where you're really grateful for an editor and an agent to just sort of say, like, get it done right. And when it comes out, it will come out. And it was a month before the book came out that the current occupant of the White House made a statement about, those, I don't know if profanity is allowed on your broadcast, but about those countries, those S-hole countries. I used the word in the piece that I wrote about it. So yeah, and I will say that alongside that responsibility, there's a really bittersweet sense of this story that as it increasingly became more relevant, the reasons that it became more relevant were super sad, and really continue to be in this country.
So I ask this delicately. I wish I had better words, and probably I shouldn't. Well, I'm just going to ask: how would this story have played out if it would have been in a different location, not in Lewiston, Maine? Do you think it would have had the same effect? How would it have unified a different community other than that which really came together for one goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Maine is a particular landscape for this story. I think the demographics of Maine before the Somali population began to grow there are critical for this story. But, if this story had happened in the Bronx, would anyone have noticed it? It's still a great sports story. And I think that that's something that has to always be in conversation with the political context in which it occurs. This isn't a team that creates any kind of overt political action. They're not taking a knee. They're not wearing black armbands. They're not raising fists over their heads. They're just playing. And they're playing for something that this school has never had happen before, right? They've never won this state championship. They're playing for a coach that's in his fourth decade of wanting that state championship, right? So already you've got the tension of a great story. And we're talking about a team that outscored its opponents across the board, across the season, 114-7.
Yeah,
right. So no matter what, it's an awesome sports story. And when you look at players like, Abdi Sharif Hassan, who's currently a senior at UMass Lowell playing D1 soccer for the Riverhawks, should that season ever happen, it's, that's just great. That's just great sports story. And so I would hope that we would still want to learn about a team like that.
Have you always enjoyed sports?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a devout, although right now pretty shaken, Red Sox fan. I'm a tennis fanatic, and I grew up kind of obsessed with the Olympic Games, and the Olympics are really, really my foray into writing about sports. My first book is about the Mexico City Olympic Games, not the triumph, but the struggle, and the Black Power action that takes place there. And it's really I think one of the first books that blows open the idea of sports as politics, sports as a civil rights story. And that comes from my real interest in understanding sports as a major stakeholder in society that we need to take a look at.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe that's because I'm blinded to other things. I just love sports so much, but I think it is a culmination of what the world is about. And what we're seeing is just phenomenal with Black Lives Matter in the NBA bubble with the playoffs taking place now. For you, have you been able to follow that as a fan, or have you been able to follow the social justice piece for the NBA as a whole this season?
The NBA this season has been almost entirely for me from a political point of view. Although I will say that an athlete, a once in a generation athlete like LeBron James always catches my eye. And I know that there's 1,000 other factors going into why the bubble has been fascinating. But I will say that watching LeBron James, I do think is a miracle every time you get to do it. I think it's entirely been about its politics, though. First, the politics of reintroducing sports in the time of a global pandemic. The fact that the NBA figured it out, what that says about basketball. You could not do with baseball what they did with basketball. The fact that, women's soccer did it and no one paid attention. The fact that the WNBA did it and not as many people paid attention. So I think that's always a takeaway. And that translates into the Black Lives Matter piece.
And Amy Bass joining us. Hopefully we will be back up soon. Amy, are you still with us?
I am still with you. You froze for a while, though.
Yeah, it just did the circle of, the spinning circle. Well, it's good to have you back. And you were just saying how the WNBA really made a statement, doing it the right way, even though it was not as publicized as the NBA. But in such a political climate, sports does give a distraction. How much are we going to need sports in the next few months, in your opinion?
So I have been of the mind that we shouldn't have sports right now. That sports are part of society. They can't be this protected part of society that gets to come back when nothing else does. So the fact that we had baseball back and my kid can't go to school still, I think it's a huge problem that we figured out sports before we figured out education. So I think that one of the things that we are seeing through the pandemic, and the pandemic isn't creating problems, the pandemic is magnifying problems, is looking at the favored status and looking at the resources and looking at the imbalance of resources in our society. And so I've written about this across the pandemic, primarily for CNN, that, we're not supposed to have sports back until we get it all back. And getting sports back first speaks volumes to us. So yes, maybe it is so that we can have a distraction. And I've been really grateful for professional soccer. And oh my gosh, the US Open felt like, 2 weeks of therapy. And it was amazing. But my kid isn't going to school, and that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And it's, people aren't eating, unemployment, you look at all of these things, and you don't want sports to, the lack of sports to exacerbate that, because sports is a multi-billion-dollar business in this country. But the fact that, we are 8 months into this thing, and the only thing that we figured out how to do is get through the NBA playoffs, that's a really screaming large problem.
Oh, it really is. I just want to talk again about your book, One Goal. When you see it in bookstores, how much pride do you have? What sort of feeling do you have knowing that all the labor of love has actually produced something worthwhile that's inspiring other people?
I haven't seen it in a bookstore in a while because I haven't been inside a store in a while. But I think that the thing that's most gratifying to me is when schools reach out and want to know if I can talk to students because they've chosen it for their common read or their 8th grade read or their 12th grade read. Or even if an individual student reaches out and says, I'm reading your book for, X assignment, can I interview you? And I always say yes, because I think that that's the part that really sort of grips. I love it when I see one of the guys who's in the book post something, on Instagram or on Twitter about it, or even if it's just sort of sitting on their desk and they're posting about something else. That's the stuff, more than sort of the pride and the self-gratification when you walk into Barnes & Noble and you see it, which is always a thrill, especially if it's on one of those front tables, never if it's on clearance. But really, it's about the readers, and readers are just a good community to be hanging out with.
Hey, so you've mentioned a couple of times your daughter was school. So my daughter just went to 2 days a week. We're up here in Vermont from 1 day. And then Wednesday, she's supposed to take off. Thursday, Friday, she's supposed to be on Zoom and doing virtual school. She's a junior in high school. She's very motivated, self-starter, much more than I ever was. So she is doing okay. But there is that sense of loss, or I would say, especially for her being a junior, a sense of disappointment that she doesn't get to experience what her brother did as a senior and everything he did. How are you speaking with your daughter about what's taking place and how it's going to give her strength to get through whatever might come in the future?
I don't know that I'm very good at it right now. She's really angry, and I understand that. And I validate that. I'm really angry, and I'm really angry at very specific people. And so I think, focusing on the what can we do and what should we be grateful for, but it's not always enough to respond to adolescent disappointment, I think, with, but we have our health, or, but we're really lucky because of this, this, and this. Those things are certainly important. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge why they're frustrated, why they're angry, and why they're disappointed. And the disappointments are just vast. And that's one of the places where I think, just to sort of circle back a little bit, why are those guys playing baseball? And I'm in my room on Zoom from 8:30 to 3:30, 5 days a week, which is what my daughter's life is right now. And so I think that, her school, she goes to school in New Rochelle, New York. Her school was one of the first public schools in the country to close because of the original containment zone. And, when you look back at what we thought on March 11th, March 12th, March 13th, you just couldn't fathom that we couldn't deal with this. Could we deal with it 100%? No, but I think that there's a real lesson here to talk to kids about in terms of what could happen and what didn't happen, and where our priorities are as a society and as a world, and when that comes into conflict with what our values are as a household.
So as an author, a professor, is this something that you are driven to write about more as, in future years, people look back at and you have things documented that we could learn from? Or is this something that is so changing, so disruptive that you're just trying to process it and you almost even fear putting pen to paper through this experience of what we're going through?
No, writing and reading have been really hard for me through the pandemic, and I'm not alone in that. A lot of writers. First of all, I'm a coffee house writer, so the lack of coffee house in my life right now is really difficult. We are a household in which everyone is working from home, doing school from home, and so I think that just those patterns are so difficult. But I've already written about it. I've written about living in the original containment zone. I have an essay about that, A View from New Rochelle. I have a couple essays that I've put out there about sports in the pandemic and sort of the inequities of what we're thinking about. I've done an awful lot lately in the media about Black Lives Matters and sports and those pieces. I have to say, I look at a moment like the Milwaukee Bucks, sitting down that day in solidarity with the family of Jacob Blake. That's a moment that is worthy of documenting, and it's a week in sports that is worthy of noting and writing about, and I've been talking about it a lot, on radio and what have you. But I think that's the kind of moment that you come back to. It's certainly, I teach a course here at Manhattanville called Sport and Social Change. And I'm offering it in the spring, I offered it last spring when sports stopped. I was teaching 3 sports seminars in a world without sports for several months. It was kind of interesting. And so that was what I had to teach, right? The void. I'm really looking forward to changing things up for this spring and incorporating, that collective politics that emerged out of that NBA bubble, looking at the WNBA and its direct involvement in electoral politics this election season, particularly in the state of Georgia. These are really important things. Athletes are emerging as a voting bloc, and we've never seen that before. And that's something that's definitely on my to-do list.
It's definitely something that we need to take note of, and I thank you for bringing it to our attention. And the book One Goal, I certainly encourage people to go and get a copy of. amybass.net, you can find it there. But Amy, a couple questions, then we'll get you out. And thanks again for making the time. It's
Sure.
a privilege and special for me, so thank you for that. The first question is this: if you were featured in a fictional movie, would you want to play the hero or the villain?
I would hope I'd be heroic. But I don't know. Does anyone pick the villain? Is this like your inside actor studio question? I will say this: all of the teenage girls that I know right now are more obsessed with Draco Malfoy than they are with Harry Potter. So maybe the villain is just always more interesting.
Well, I always pick the villain because I think I'm supposed to be good. So if it's a fictional movie, then I could play the
play
villain.
Bad for a while, sure.
Yeah, and now, if or when, maybe I should say when, the feature film is made about you, who plays you in that feature film?
Oh God, I have no idea. I truly would have no way of casting somebody with a tremendous amount of patience.
So I always say Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson for me. Not that we look anything alike, but I just think I'd like Dwayne Johnson to play me in some feature film one day.
I'll go with Emma Stone just because she's she's plucky and kind of awesome.
Now, the second part to this question, which drives my wife nuts, but I've asked it so many times now, she knows it's coming. Who plays your love interest in that feature film about your life? And I say Halle Berry, which my wife does not look like Halle Berry, but my wife is phenomenal. So I think Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Halle Berry, that'd be a movie worth watching.
I'm going to bring Andre Agassi into the acting world because he's been my obsession from a young age, and he remains that.
So I say this respectfully: long-haired Andre Agassi or bald Andre?
I will take Andre in any way, shape, or form.
Amy, thanks so much for making the time. We wish you all the best and stay safe. And we certainly think of your daughter as we're all going through just a time of disruption and change. But thanks, Amy, for making the time.
Thank you, Jeff. Take care.
And again, that's Amy Bass making some time for us, amybass.net. The name of the book is One Goal. Certainly get a copy of that. I've heard great things. The athletic director at Harwood Union High School loved it, and he was so excited about this this interview today. You can certainly subscribe. Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, and Google Podcasts, the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews. We believe people's stories make our stories much better. So listen and learn from one another. We'll be back soon. Talk to you all later. Jay Fuller Interviews, Google Podcasts, the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews.